So to understand how humans are affecting our environment, it's really important to understand our population and how many humans there are. And the reason that matters is because humans use resources, and the more humans you have, the more resources we use. And so by understanding the trends in human population, it also helps to describe the trends in human consumption. And so this graphic is showing us about 7 billion people. We actually have more than that. So if we take a look at the human population over the past 2,000 years, you can see that we actually had fairly slow growth for a good majority of our history. But if you see, it's not until about 1800 that we hit 1 billion people. Humans have been around for about 200,000 years, and so not hitting 1 billion people until 1800 is kind of interesting. Then you notice we hit 2 billion people in, say, 1950. I will say you do not need to know these dates, but I want to show you this trend. So 2 billion in 1950, 3 billion in, say, 1970, 4 billion in like 1980, etc., etc. And as you noticed, that it's taking less and less time to add 1 billion people. Our population is growing incredibly fast. If you look at the shape of this graph, maybe you are familiar from your math classes, potentially even an economics class, that this is kind of exponential growth. Humans are growing incredibly quickly. We are currently at about 7.7 billion people. That's 7.7 billion people who need homes, who need water, who need food. And so there's a lot of resources that go into fueling this human population. And the thing is, we're only going to keep growing. And so one of the big questions that have been asked, not just by scientists, but people who work in social welfare and other organizations such as the United Nations, is how many people can we support? How many people can Earth support with its resources? When does it become too many people? Now, some people say, oh, right now. Well, maybe humans aren't very, good at conserving those resources, but we could. And so this estimate is really based on if we were using our resources optimally, how many people could Earth sustain? And the United Nations estimated about 10 billion people could be supported by Earth's resources. Now again, this is suggesting that we are conserving our resources a lot better than we are today. Now this number, this 10 billion people, we're not there yet, so that's kind of good news for us and for our generation. But this 10 billion isn't what it always used to be. This carrying capacity, the number of organisms our Earth can support, has increased. We haven't always been able to withhold 10 billion people. In the year 0, Earth couldn't support 10 billion people. In 1600, Earth couldn't support 10 billion people. But it's not because we now have more resources on Earth. It's because humans are better using those resources. So for example, we can live in new places. If you look at year 0, we may have been limited to more temperate regions. We might not have been able to sustain large populations in dry regions, in cold regions, and incredibly hot regions because we didn't have the knowledge and the know-how to do water transport, air conditioning, heating. And so because we can live in new places, that means we've been able to expand our population and people could live in places they couldn't live before. Another important reason why our carrying capacity is increasing and the number of humans that can be supported is increasing is because of our ability to make food has only gotten better. We have been able to increase our agricultural output, not just in the United States, but around the world. We make more food now than we have ever made before. And it's just because of kind of the technology that comes behind agriculture. With the onset of GMOs, this has increased even more. And then finally, is thinking about disease. And so if we look at when the Black Plague occurred, and we lost about a third of the human population, a lot of it, or the reason that disease was able to spread so quickly, is because we didn't really understand disease. We didn't understand that, you shouldn't touch other people's liquids that are coming out of their building. Other people's liquids coming out of their body. We didn't understand that we needed to clean the water that they were using and the water that we were using. And because we understand disease better, that means that when humans are in close areas and they're in dense areas, think of a downtown city, think of Times Square in New York, that if you're sick, you understand how to not infect other people. If you are a healthy person, you understand what you need to do to not get sick. And so although we still have diseases, although we still have illnesses, we've gotten a lot better in preventing those diseases from spreading in the population. And because of that, we're able to have a bigger population. We can prevent a disease from widespread killing all of us. So although the United Nations currently says that we can support about 10 billion individuals, that number may change. In 10 years, that number may increase because we have even more technologies, or maybe that number could potentially decrease. It could decrease because we have overused our resources. So it's just a really incredible metric to really understand because of the amount of resources that go into the human population. Another way that we can identify our human population is not looking just at our overall growth. How many humans did we add last year? We can also look at a metric called the total fertility rate, or TFR for short. And what the TFR measures is the average number of children that a woman has. Now you may think, well, not everyone has children, but this is just saying if you take all of the children and all of the women, it is just doing an average. So how many children did a woman have? You can look at this at a couple different scales. You could look at it by city. This map is showing you TFRs by country, and in just a moment we'll take a look at a TFR globally, so what's happening around the world. So let's take a moment just to dissect this map that popped up, which is the TFR by country. Now, some of the biggest countries in the world by population are China and India. And you can see China has about 1 to 2 children per woman, whereas India has about 2 to 3 children per woman. Which is kind of surprising because you would think it'd be a lot higher because of how large their populations are. Each of these countries both have over 1 billion individuals. We'll talk about why in just a moment. If you look at the United States, we're also in the 1 to 2 range, same with Canada. And you may have noticed that here in Africa, particularly Central Africa, that our TFRs are a lot higher. 5 to 6, some countries 6 to 7 children per woman. Now this might be surprising because you're like, well, I don't know of any African country that has a huge population. TFRs can give us insight on the population growth of a particular country, but it's not the whole story. For some of these countries, yeah, a mother may have 6 children, but in areas that have very little health care, in areas that have poor water quality, you might have 6 children, but that doesn't mean that all 6 of those children survive to adulthood, survive to make children of their own. If you look at China, China has the one-child policy, which kind of explains why they have 1 to 2 children per woman, but it wasn't always the case. China used to be a much higher TFR, and it's changed over the years and has slowed down their population growth. So TFRs are just another way to kind of categorize a country as well as categorize the world. And that's what this graph is looking at. This graph is looking at the total fertility rate over time. The first time slot we have here is 1950 to 1955, and this is at about 4.9. We'll just say 5. So if we look around the entire world, all the women in the world and all the children in the world, women on average are having 5 children. That's crazy to think about. But it was really out of necessity. Without having a lot of the technological advances that we have today, it was necessary literally to have children in order to run your business. If we look at today, or the most recent I have is 2017, we are at 2.43. So we'll just say half. We are at half our fertility rate. So the number of children we're having has greatly declined. Now, something that's kind of important to think about is what TFR would we need in order to have no population growth? We're at 7.7 billion people now. If we wanted to stay at 7.7 billion people, how do we do that? How do we maintain our current population? Sure, we might be able to support 10 billion individuals, but maybe we want to avoid 10 billion individuals. So in order to get to no population growth, it's not zero. 0 would mean you're having no children. 0 would mean your population would greatly decline, and within 100 years, you wouldn't have a population. So it's not 0. What we're looking for is, we'll talk about 2, and I'll explain the 2.1 in just a moment, is 2. You have a mom, and you have a dad, and they have 2 children. And those 2 children represent replacing mom and dad. And then each of those children, they'll make babies with a partner, and their children will replace them and their partner. So we need at least 2 in order to stay the same. If you have more than 2, let's say you have 3, your population would grow. You have less than 2, your population shrinks. If you have 2, it's going to stay about the same. But you notice it's not actually 2, it's 2.1. And before you think, really, what's the difference between 2 and 2.1? Well, if there's 3.5 billion women in the world, whether they have 2 or whether they have 2.1 children can actually be a huge difference in that population. So the reason for 0.1, and this might be something you're familiar with, is that not all women and not all men have good fertility. There might be some disease they have, there might be some illness they have that prevents them from having a child and birthing a child. And so what that means is that some families need to have 3 children or 4 children to make up for the families that can't have children. Now you may be thinking, oh, well, you don't need kids, or what if it's a guy and they want kids? This is really looking at like just the purely scientific male, female, have 2 children, preferably male, female, 50-50 ratio. Yes, there's adoption and there's all these things and there's in vitro fertilization. Just kind of ignore all that. This is just saying in basic fundamentals, how many children do we need to have in order for our population to kind of remain stable at where it is right now? So that was just a quick introduction into human population growth. Again, the reason this matters, why it matters we have 7.7 billion people, why it matters that our carrying capacity is increasing and how it's increased, and what is our total fertility rate, is because we use resources. We use the environment. We take advantage of what's out there. And the more people you have, the more of an impact it has on Earth. One last thing I want to say, although our population is growing, every single moment of the day, the global population increases, the rate is decreasing. We are slowing down how much we are increasing our population. We're not making 5 babies anymore. We're making about 2.5 babies. So we are slowing down. We're not going to keep growing exponentially like that curve showed us. It's going to slow down, and it's going to start arcing, and it's going to start leveling out. So it's not all doom and gloom. Our population is slowing down. Still increasing, but not increasing nearly to the rate that we were before.